Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining from. I'm Bruce DelMonico, Assistant Dean for Admissions here at the Yale School of Management. I'm joined by my fellow Assistant Dean, Laurel Grodman. In this hour and 15 minutes we have with you, we're going to try and share as much advice as we can about applying to Yale SOM and especially how to think about our round three application deadline, which is coming up on April 8th. The first half hour, Laurel and I will be dispensing wisdom to you all. And then for the remainder of the time, starting roughly 12:30 US Eastern Time until 1:15, our colleagues Kelsey, Rebecca, and Mooney will be in breakout rooms so you can get to know more members of the admissions committee and have more of an interactive question and answer session with them to ask the questions that are most pressing for you as you're thinking about your round three application. Before we get to that, Laurel and I have our pearls of wisdom that we want to share. Again, I'm Bruce DelMonico. I'm Assistant Dean for Admissions. I've been at Yale SOM for over 20 years have been, before that I was a lawyer, but have been part of the admissions team now for 2 decades and involved with application construction and evaluation over that time. Although my colleague Laurel is really the primary force there. So Laurel, I'll let you introduce yourself too.
Hey everyone, most importantly, I've spent a lot of time at Yale as not just in my current capacity, but as a student, both at Yale undergrad and most importantly at Yale School of Management. But as Bruce said, I have been working in the admissions office for, I guess, about a decade at this point, primarily overseeing evaluation, our application process, and running our committee. And I have not exclusively been in New Haven during that time. In between my MBA and coming back to work at Yale, I worked in marketing and brand management. So glad that you're all here to join us today. I'm looking forward to talking about round three.
Yeah, and thanks so much, Laurel. And let's just jump right into it. I think we have a shorter amount of time. We have maybe half an hour before we break out into the individual sessions. And we do the session before each application deadline. But I think we're going to really target, dispense with the niceties, as it were, and target round three and specific, questions you might have about round three. For more general application advice, we do have a whole suite of resources for you. We have our application guide, which we updated with some videos that help you think about each section of the application. We have a whole, an application section on our website that has, our kind of gathers all our resources together. So there's a lot of information, a lot of resources there. And I know specifically for those of you who are applying as Silver Scholars in round three, that's a big Silver Scholar round. There's some resources for Silver Scholars as well that we can share for those of you who are in your final year of undergraduate college seniors and thinking about applying to us to start in the fall. So those are some really good general pieces of advice and general resources that we are happy to share. But specific to round three, I think Laura and I will go back and forth, maybe asking questions of each other, just with the questions that are most top of mind to you, based on the questions you submitted beforehand and just the things that we know are kind of most pressing. And I guess I'd love to just jump right in, if that's okay, and ask maybe the big question. Round three, what are my chances of getting in? How many slots are left? Are we more selective? I know that's always one of the questions once we get to the third round in spring, is the class full? What's going on?
Well, as Bruce well knows, I don't have the answer to that question because it depends on a lot of things. I think maybe the most reassuring thing to say is there will be room in the class. We model for there to be room in the class and to be able to admit people in round three. And ideally, if we're doing our jobs right, your odds of being admitted in one round versus another shouldn't really change depending on your individual application. So if you're a competitive candidate in rounds one and two, then by and large, you'll be a competitive candidate in round three as well. I think the variability and maybe where some of the nervousness comes from around round three applicants is it is a little bit dependent on enrollment up until that point. And so in advance of round three, we'll know how many people from our first two rounds have accepted their spots at the Yale School of Management. So if way more people accept their spots than we are expecting, then there will be less room in round three. But I think, having done this for quite some time, we're fairly comfortable in knowing that, it makes sense to have a round three. We know that we're going to have room for lots of super qualified applicants. I'll add also round three tends to be among sort of the most popular rounds for our silver scholars to apply. So silver scholars being our program that allows people to matriculate directly out of undergrad. So we actually see the bulk of our applicants applying in rounds 2 and 3 for that program, which makes sense as people are sort of exiting their senior year and making plans for their next steps. So that, I think that's worth calling out there as well. And maybe a specific version of that question is, are international candidates still able to apply in round 3 and have time to sort of secure visas and so on?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, one I know are, lots of candidates are thinking about. We've never, I think maybe some other schools have done this, but we've never limited round 3 only to domestic US candidates. It's been open to all applicants, regardless of where they're coming from, regardless of citizenship. That remains the case. And so anybody who's thinking about applying, regardless of whether you're a sort of US citizen or permanent resident or sort of foreign national, are welcome to apply. I know there are some questions about sort of visas and the ability to get here, and there's maybe some speculation about what the timeframes. We don't have any specific information that would suggest that things will be any different than they have been in the past, and we're acting on sort of the best information we have, which is, we've done this in the past. Round 3 has been open to all applicants in the past. International candidates, international admitted students have been able to secure visas and get to New Haven in time in the past. Those are the assumptions we're working off of this year as well. But I think we are advising people, just because there may be some uncertainty, there may be some wrinkles in the process, to start the visa process as early as you can. So if you are apply in round 3, which is an April 8th deadline coming up in a little less than a month, you'll get a decision in mid-May. And our advice would be to start the visa process very soon after then, and not wait until sort of June or July before doing so, just to give yourselves as much time as possible to sort of get your documentation, get your visa interview, get cleared, and be here in New Haven for the start of orientation in August. So the short answer is business as usual. We will continue to consider and admit candidates and international candidates in round 3. But definitely start the visa process as soon as you can would be our best advice.
Yeah, I'd say even beyond that. I mean, you mentioned we'll release decisions in mid-May. I think if there's any sort of different or particular advice, I'd say is be ready to make a decision as early as possible. You can't start the visa process until you've enrolled in a school. And so I think the more you're prepared to make decisions based on the information that you've been given by the schools that you've applied to, and the faster you are able to enter that process, if you're admitted, I think that's the better. I see a question. I realize neither of us really addressed one of the questions that I'm sure is on lots of people's mind about round 3 as well, is scholarships. So what are the odds of getting a scholarship in round 3? And I'd say it's pretty similar to my response earlier, just about the odds of getting in. We do have likely some scholarship funding available in round 3. It may not be as plentiful to the extent that it's plentiful in any round. It may not be as available, again, depending on who enrolls and what scholarship budget we have used thus far. But there's no sort of hard and fast rule that there's no scholarships available. And ideally, we have left some funding. But I would, again, thinking about being prepared, whether you're an international student or not, to make a decision relatively quickly, because you're going to want your life figured out and understanding kind of what your next steps are. I'd really give some serious thought at this stage in the process about sort of your ability to enroll with or without a scholarship, which everyone should always be assuming, a scholarship is never a given, but particularly in round 3, there being a real possibility that might not be on the table.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and I saw that question come up too, and I think we were going to get to that, so it's good to get to it sooner rather than later, since it was on top of mind. Another question I think I don't know, that people often have, it has to do with the standardized tests, the GMAT and the GRE. Do we offer test waivers, especially for round three, as people are maybe putting together applications? Where do we stand on sort of the testing requirement for the MBA application?
Good question. So, no test waivers or any sort of alternative tests are available through our process. So we expect everyone to apply with either a GRE or a GMAT score, and we accept both the older version of the GMAT and the newer GMAT focus, as long as the older version is still valid within its sort of 5-year test taking period. And I know that that's not the answer that everybody wants to hear, but I think maybe the more important thing is to emphasize that we are not looking only at your testing. We ask for your test because it is a component of your application that can give us a sense of your academic readiness. We're looking at that in conjunction with your undergraduate history, any other formal university coursework that you've done, either through a graduate program or through just extra courses, any kind of other, preparatory work that you've done for the program. We're looking at your behavioral assessment, which I know we'll talk about a little bit later, but we take a number of different pieces of information to kind of triangulate your academic readiness for the program. And the testing is one of those things. And for some candidates who have not done as well in those other areas as they might have hoped, the testing can be really helpful and important to give us a sense of whether you're prepared for the program. I think for others, where you've been able to demonstrate your readiness through some of those other areas, we may weight the test less heavily because you have that background and exposure. So I wouldn't let testing get in the way of applying in round three. And we'll talk a little bit later about maybe the pros and cons of putting in a round three application. I think it's mostly pros. But, I would, if your test isn't exactly where you want it yet and you're debating, do I apply this year or apply next year? I wouldn't let a lower test score that you're hoping to get up in a future take be the reason that you don't apply in round three. Because again, we're looking at a number of things to look at your academic prep.
Yeah. If I can ask follow up with two sort of sub questions that I saw coming through the chat. Are there any minimum test requirements for us? And is there a deadline for when those tests need to be submitted?
Yep. Again, no minimum requirements because we're looking at all of this information holistically. So there's no kind of cutoff within the testing. I mean, you can go online to our class profile page to get a sense of kind of the ranges of test scores and GPAs and things like that our current class falls in. I wouldn't get too fixated on those numbers. It's a range, and there's of course going to be people above and below that range. I guess what I'd keep in mind is if you find yourself far out of that range on sort of on the lower end, bear in mind we're going to be looking for compensatory kind of information elsewhere. So it is unlikely someone's going to be admitted with, a far below range, test score, but who's also far below range academically. And that's, you can gauge for yourself, going to be a lot to overcome. But I would bear in mind, again, that range isn't a cutoff, and we look at everyone's application regardless of score. The second question in terms of the timing, so you really ought to have your test taken by the deadlines. The deadline's the 8th. You're going to want a finished test to submit by that time. Realistically, if it is, a day or two after the deadline, we're still going to do our best to absorb that information and review your application in round three. But you really can't go much beyond that because round three is so short. There just won't be time really to work into the review process. If you are retaking the test at some point before we release decisions, we encourage you certainly give us that update, and we're going to do our very best to incorporate whatever new information you have to share. But the later it gets, the harder it is to do that. So I encourage you to plan your testing as best as you can for before the deadline date or really, really close to that deadline date. So we'll have as much information as possible when we're reviewing.
That's good.
So again, we're not going to focus a whole lot on the actual application evaluation parts. And Bruce called out a whole bunch of resources, including videos from us on how to approach the different parts. But the one part, or maybe one of the few parts I'll bring up here specifically is the essay, because that is an aspect of our application that is unique and you'll want to give some thought to. So Bruce, can you explain a little bit more about what we are looking for in our essay prompt?
Yeah, happy to do that. And the essay probably is, in this last month or few weeks leading up to the deadline, one of the things you're probably working on and refining. And we have one required essay. You can choose among 3 different prompts for that one essay. So it's just one essay, but a choice of 3 possible topics, which is the biggest commitment you've made, the most meaningful community you've been part of, or the greatest challenge you've faced. And a few quick things I would say about the essay. We don't have a preference for which topic you choose. It used to be just one topic and everyone wrote on that topic, but we felt as though people were kind of trying to force fit things that didn't quite fit into that topic into the essay prompt. And so that's why we went with the 3 choices to really make sure that you're able to write about the thing that's most meaningful to you. And with that in mind, choose whichever of those topics does align with the thing you want to talk about the most. So it could be commitment, it could be community, it could be challenge. We don't have a preference among those 3. There's no one better topic to write about. I would say as well, you can write about something personal or something professional. It does not have to be, and even though this is an MBA application, it doesn't have to be about your MBA journey or your professional life. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. And somewhat for that same reason, you don't have to connect it to a why MBA and why Yale. Certainly, if you're writing about something personal, it doesn't make that's probably not going to flow directly from the topic. We have other places in the application, other parts of the process where we ask you a little bit about why the MBA, why Yale, and kind of your future goals. You don't need to put those into the essay, especially because it's a 500-word limit. So it's a little tight real estate, and it's we want to make sure you're focused on that topic, the commitment, the community, the challenge. And then I would say the last thing I would say is when you're writing the essay, we really want you to be as specific as you can about the behaviors that support the topic that you choose. So if you're talking about a commitment, it's not just philosophically or theoretically you're the kind of person who is committed to this type of thing, but what did you do to demonstrate your what you've done in service of that commitment? And the same thing with the community and the challenge. It's not that I identify with or I align with this community intellectually. What have you done to sort of show how you're part of that community or what that community means to you? So really think about being concrete about those behaviors, those actions, and that's the thing that that we probably care about the most when we're looking at what you're writing about in the essay. I don't know. Did I miss anything, Laurel?
No, I think that covers it.
Okay. I think another thing, to maybe people are wondering about, obviously, the job market, the landscape has been a little bit unsettled in the last, little stretch. What if you're thinking about applying and you're unemployed, or you have a job disruption? How should that be kind of addressed in the application?
Yeah, so I'll imagine that some of the folks on our call today are in that very situation. It is sometimes why people choose to apply in round 3. It wasn't necessarily in the cards through rounds 1 and 2. Well, you're gainfully employed and something has changed, and that is totally okay. It's okay if that's your situation now. It's okay if that was your situation 2 years ago and you have a gap on your resume. Life happens. That's not a disqualifying kind of factor. If anything, if you're currently unemployed or have experienced some kind of job disruption, that might be, in a strange way to our benefit, and that really, really talented people might turn to the prospect of getting an MBA who might not have at that point in time. So it's not a stigma. It's not something that needs to be kind of hidden or explained away. But it does need to be explained in the sense that we're trying to get a sense of your entire career trajectory, including the times that you weren't employed and if that time is now. So we make it very clear where we're looking to gain that information. So in the work experience experience section, you'll answer a sort of a yes/no question as to whether you've had a gap in employment or unemployment, gap of 3 or more months, or current unemployment. If that's the case, you'll check the box and you'll have an opportunity to tell us a little bit about that. You don't need to give us, a 2-page essay on it by any means. If it's a simple explanation, just share that with us. But it's important to share that with us just so we understand where you are in that context and we're not making up, you're tempted to make up stories or just, wonder what was going on. If you were laid off, that's relevant information to share as well. Again, it's not necessary, it's not a stigma, but the more that you can sort of highlight what the situation was and lay it out, that's important. I think it's important to share with us kind of either if it was a past gap or something that's taking place now, just what you're up to. Are you actively job searching? Are you engaging in some sort of other activity or learning or something that's taking up your time? But the more information you can give us, I think the more helpful it is to kind of construct your entire career trajectory, even if that includes some gaps.
Yep.
Let's see. Do applicants need to explain why they waited until round 3 to apply, or why they're applying in round 3, if that's if it wasn't necessarily a waiting game?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, you definitely correct me on this. I mean, we consistent with this sort of the theme of the job disruption of unemployment, there's no stigma to applying in round 3, so that our default assumption is like, what's going on? What's wrong with you? Why you wait? Why did you wait? Round 3 is one of our rounds. We have 3 application rounds. People time their applications differently depending on when they're ready to apply. There are lots of reasons why you would apply in rounds 1, 2, or 3. And so we're not skeptical like what's going on? Why'd you apply in round 3? That's one of our, it's rounds that we've set out at the beginning of the year, and plenty of people apply then. So there's no need for you to explain why you waited or why the timing. I mean, and somewhat to Laurel's point, it might, you might touch on that, and if you have a sort of a gap or a disruption, and you talk about the employment gap, and that might be wrapped, why you apply in round 3 might be wrapped into that. Or we didn't also talk about there's an optional, information session, an optional statement where you can incorporate other parts of the other information into your application that you weren't able to address elsewhere. Maybe that's relevant to that, but you don't feel as though you need to explain or that we're looking at it skeptically or there's some stigma or bias to applying in round 3. Again, it's just one of our rounds. I don't know, again, Laurel, if you would add anything to that, or if that seems.
Sure, I think the job gap place you mentioned makes sense. Again, it's not a requirement, but if the fact of this being round 3 has just impacted any element of your application, such as, and I just took the test, I'm planning on sitting for it again in another 2 weeks. I mean, you could share that information with us in the optional statement. So I think that's right. Just inherently, you don't have to justify a round 3 application, but if it helps us understand some aspect of your application that we are asking about, then you're welcome to share the information, on the timing choice.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way to put it. And another question, we have a couple more, and then maybe some wrap-up thoughts before we do the breakout rooms in maybe sort of 5-10 minutes. You alluded to the behavioral assessment earlier. I think there was a question in the chat about the behavioral assessment. So one thing that people are wondering about is how's the Yale process unique? What's unique about the Yale SOM application?
I think we talked about the essays. I do think we'd have, distinct essay prompts, which you've already covered. I think the behavioral assessment, which I alluded to, and the video questions. So those are 2 components that come after you hit submit. I think those are probably the most distinctive parts of the application. I mean, obviously every school asks for kind of core information about your academics and your work, and you want to pay attention to the specifics of how we ask about those things, but generally speaking, that information that you're prepping is broadly relevant. But the behavioral assessment and the video questions are I think a little bit different within our process. So again, both of them are due after you hit submit. So make sure that you pay close attention to what we call our post-application materials deadline. That is when both of those components will be due, and you won't receive links to either of them until you've actually hit submit. So just keep in mind, you'll have just a short kind of period of time to complete those steps. So I'll start with the video questions are prompts that you'll hear. It's a series of 3 prompts asked by either one of us or a member of our team. I can't remember who's asking the current video questions, but you'll have an opportunity to hear a question, depending on the question, 15 or I guess 20 or 30 seconds to think about your response. And then depending on the question, either 60 or 90 seconds to deliver a response. So it's not an interview, and it's not a video essay. So it's not something you're going to prepare ahead of time, but it is just an opportunity to interact a little bit more kind of naturally with a member of the admissions committee, in a more kind of spontaneous setting. So the primary kind of purpose of this is, I guess, twofold. One, we don't have a testing or an English language testing requirement. So if you're a non-native English speaker, we are not asking for a TOEFL or an IELTS or a Duolingo test or anything like that. We're instead having all of our applicants complete video questions. And then more generally, it just gives us another dimension to your profile, a sense of how you articulate yourself on your feet, which is an important skill in an MBA classroom and in life more generally. This isn't the most crucial part of your application. You're probably not going to be admitted or not admitted based on your video questions, but it is an additional data point that we have within the context of your full application. So my number one piece of advice on video questions: don't read off of a script, even if it's, the notes that you jotted down when you heard the question and were formulating your thoughts. It never comes off well. You'll be much better off giving an imperfect, but, or organically articulated response than if you were reading off of a screen. It is always more obvious than you think it is. So that's my number one piece of advice there. And then the behavioral assessment, there's really nothing you need to do to prep for it. It is a non-cognitive assessment. So unlike the GMAT or the GRE, that's a cognitive test, this is looking at interpersonal and intrapersonal skills that we know are associated with success in the business school classroom. And even more specifically, as I teed up before, we actually use it to evaluate academic readiness. So this isn't sort of a personality test of what kind of people do we want in the classroom, but instead we're looking at traits that we know are associated with classroom success, academic success, above and beyond your test scores and your GPA. So specifically, we're looking at this for candidates who may not have as strong an academic history, have not done as well in the test, or have not done as well in their undergraduate performance, but nonetheless have the skills that we know are predictive of being able to do well in a tough MBA program. So it's really only meant to be additive for candidates who may not have that sort of demonstrated success in their own background. There's no right or wrong answers. It's a series of, I think, 130 pairings of two different statements, and you have to pick the one that feels more like you. So it might be, I'm an organized person and I like going to meetings, and you just pick the one that feels more like you. No one answer is going to be determinative of your success in the application process. In fact, the entire thing is not going to be determinative. But it is, like I said, it's an opportunity for us to look at your academic readiness through a different lens than the information that we're already getting. Those are, I think, the most important things to call out. I'll just mention as well the interview, just because that will happen very quickly in the process of round 3. So interviews are by invitation only. Everyone who's admitted will have an opportunity to interview, and that interview will be conducted either by a second-year student, a recent alumni, or a member of the admissions team. And all of those interviews in round 3 will be over Zoom. So if you're invited to interview, you'll receive an invitation through email and be invited to a 30-minute interview with one of those people that I mentioned. Maybe just the last question. Biggest mistake that you see people make, or maybe a 2-part question. What is the biggest mistake that you would suggest people try to avoid, and how do you stand out in the process?
Yeah, good questions. And I'll answer that. Maybe we can give our, I see we're at 12:30 now, give our kind of sort of best app advice, and then go into the breakouts. And I think sort of the biggest mistake, how to stand out, it's kind of two sides of the same coin. I think the biggest, one of the biggest mistakes, I think, is people who try to stand out in a kind of inauthentic way, and are really trying to, come up with a hook that will make them kind of compelling to us. I think the goal is in the application process from your perspective shouldn't be to try to stand out, but to try to present your most compelling candidacy. And often that's just, it sounds trite, but you're just being yourself. Not saying I'm going to be this candidate, or I'm going to be that candidate, or I'm going to position myself in some strategic way to be more compelling. Usually the people who are really intentionally trying to stand out, often they will stand out for not the best reasons. It's as we're reviewing applications, we want to make sure all the pieces of the application sort of make sense. And if you're trying to kind of shade your application one way or the other, or kind of present yourself in a way that's not really an accurate depiction of who you are, it kind of shows in the application. So I guess the best advice I would give is don't try to stand out. Don't try to game it. Don't try to sort of overthink it, or kind of like predict what we're looking for. I think we're looking to assemble a kind of very, very talented, very diverse class of people with different backgrounds and different experiences and different aspirations. And so don't think you need to be any sort of particular kind of candidate to have an advantage in the process. So I think that's the thing I would say most in terms of a mistake or thinking about how to stand out.
That's all good advice. So do we want to wrap up with some final pearls of wisdom?
Yes, and sort of dispense with our gems. I guess the first I can start. The first thing I would say is, there's really no, and I think we might have alluded to this. There's really no downside to applying in round three. If you are ready to and want to start an MBA program in the fall, you sort of have to apply in round three. Like if you don't apply, you won't be able to start in the fall. And there's no, I think we might touch on this as well, but there's no stigma or bias to applying in round three and not being successful and then applying in the subsequent year, reapplying. We welcome reapplications. I think the admit rate for reapplicants, I believe, is roughly on par with that for first-time applicants. And actually, if you apply and are unsuccessful, you can get feedback over the summer from us, and we can talk. To the extent we have any feedback we can give in ways for you to kind of either improve or work on your candidacy, we're happy to do that, and then that can help serve as a basis for a subsequent application. So really, I guess one thing I would say, there's no downside to applying in round three. It's sort of the Wayne Gretzky, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take kind of situation. So I think just take that to heart and realize that there's no stigma again to reapplying if you're not successful, and hope maybe you will. And if you are successful, that's great. You start in the MBA program in the fall.
No, I can't underscore that enough. I mean, I think not only the opportunity to get feedback, which is helpful, but just having been through the process already, like so many things, this is an iterative process and you learn something going through it each time. And the fact of being able to do kind of a, very formal dress rehearsal, even if you feel not quite ready, I think is only going to put you in a better place to apply in a subsequent year. And we do, if you are a reapplicant, we give you an opportunity in your reapplication to share with us, what's changed since the last time, where have you grown, where have you refocused? And so it's very much sort of a part of the application experience for many people. So I wouldn't view it as this is going to be a mark that follows you into future years. It's, I think, quite the opposite. I think maybe a piece of advice I'd like to share is just follow our lead. I like to think about the application as a dialogue. We're very, very thoughtful and careful about the questions that we ask you because we want to get the information that will help us, evaluate your candidacy and make a decision. So focus on what we've asked you, not on what we wish we asked you. Bruce, I think, alluded earlier to the essay. It's not a why do you want to go to Yale essay, and it's 500 words. And I absolutely would not recommend wasting 100 of those words, or really even 50 of those words, on answering why you want to go to Yale, because we promise that's not a secret. Why do you want to go to Yale? Question. So I think that's good advice for the whole application. Really kind of, there's no hidden traps that we're trying to get you to walk into. What we're asking is what we're asking for a reason, and then just, engage in a candid dialogue with us.
Yeah. I think sort of building on that, and something I mentioned previously in the context of, the biggest mistake is don't overthink it. As Laura said, sir, follow our lead. Think about it as a dialogue. We try to make the process as sort of straightforward and knowable as possible. Jen posted some of the resources we have, the application guide, the other information. If you're on the session, hopefully you're getting emails from us, and you'll be getting our inbox application insights, where in the weeks leading up to the deadline, we give you advice on how to approach different elements of the application. The application itself, we try to make it, I think it's one of those, shorter applications among MBA programs. We try to make it simple, straightforward. We know it's can be a stressful process, and we try to kind of lower the temperature as much as we can, make it as straightforward as we can, because we want you to focus on, the things that are most meaningful to you. We want to focus on the information that is most important for us, and not have lots of extraneous information or lots of kind of random things in there. So, we're trying to not overthink it on our end, and we suggest that you not overthink it on your end as well. And I guess one piece of advice I mentioned, so our inbox application insights. Hopefully you are getting emails from us. If you, for whatever reason, are not, please sign up. You will get those IAI. You will also obviously get a recording of this session and access to our other recorded sessions, that can give you advice as you're thinking about your round 3 application.
Right. And I want to make sure that people can get to the the next stage and ask some of the individual questions. So I guess I'll wrap up by saying, as cliche as it might sound, I would definitely use this experience just as an opportunity for self-reflection and self-assessment. There's so few stages in your career where you really have an opportunity to do that and think about what the next chunk of your life is going to look like. And it could look like something very different from what you're doing now. And so regardless of what the outcome is of this process, I mean, hopefully it results in you going to business school in the coming year or in one of the next few years, but regardless, really take this as an opportunity to self-reflect, think about what it is that you want to do next and the different ways that you can get there. Because whatever your next steps are going to be, we're confident they're going to be bright. And we're really looking forward to getting to know you more in this process, hopefully in round 3, or if not, in a future cycle.
Well, that's like, I think, a great place to end. Thank you again. I want to thank you all for being here today. It was great to see you. We really appreciate your time. Hope this session was helpful. Thank you for joining it. And as Laura said, we look forward to getting to know you better through your applications.